Hello folks, something that's been getting a lot of attention has been the World of Warcraft development team's plans to introduce much stricter limitations on add-ons than we've been used to in the past. In recent years, there has been quite a few calls for add-ons to be banned or restricted from a variety of sources, but it appears that now there are some real concrete plans from Blizzard to do just that. The mood of the community is turning out to be one of apprehension and worry. Part of the reason for this worry is that the developers have chosen to be pretty vague about what exactly is going to be restricted. But this is also being worsened by the new features the development team have been adding to the default UI to replace add-on functionality, not really hitting the mark for many players. However, those built-in replacements, along with some of the few more specific details that Blizzard have shared publicly, do provide us with some major clues as to what the restrictions will be, and that allows us to speculate about what add-ons are going to be impacted. But before I dive into that, let's take a look about exactly what we do know about Blizzard's plans. With the rise of a live-streamed Race to World First, we've been given a grandstand view into the crazy extremes that the competitors will go to, but it has also led to an influx of sponsorship and community support, which, while not enough to make those competitors particularly wealthy, has allowed the big three teams to employ full-time developers, something that has significantly increased the sophistication of the weak orders and add-ons that they use. These tools and techniques have been increasingly trickling out to the wider community, meaning that the player base is better equipped than ever to handle the challenges that Blizzard have thrown at us. The end result is that both Heroic and Mythic raiding, along with Mythic Plus, has been getting steadily harder and more complex, to the extent that even World of Warcraft's game director has openly admitted that the team are now designing encounters around the community making use of these add-ons. Or in other words, add-ons are effectively becoming compulsory in higher end content. That, of course, is a major issue. It is still possible to play at a mainstream level in World of Warcraft, be it Heroic raiding or Mythic Plus 10s without add-ons, but doing so now requires well above average skill levels, and the truth is that for the average player, add-ons are indeed near enough essential. The end result is a major barrier for entry for new players, but let's also be a bit blunt here. Arguably, it is also evidence that the standard game's user interface just isn't fit for purpose anymore, and it's therefore no wonder that the development team have decided to take action, both in terms of making improvements to the user interface, but also in looking for ways to try and cool down the growing arms race between themselves and add-on developers. The developers have thankfully realised that simply giving in to the vocal minority who calls for that add-on ban would be an absolute disaster, and instead they plan to start adding the main feature sets of those major add-ons into the default user interface before they start to introduce any limitations on them. The hope, I suspect, will be to make the loss of some key add-ons feel a lot less jarring and painful for us players when it does happen. We have now seen the first two of the major additions to the default user interface, with the cooldown manager, which provides a head-up display style rotational cooldown tracker similar to the very popular weak order based versions provided by developers like Luxos, along with the combat assistance, which provides recommendations on the next ability to use, similar to the rotational helper add-ons like Hakili. Game director Ian Hazzikostas has also shared that the team are planning to introduce a boss timeline tool, which will provide information in upcoming raid mechanics, likely intended to replace boss timer add-ons like DBM and Bigwigs, along with a detail style damage meter, and they've also confirmed that they do have longer term plans for a desperately needed revamp of nameplates. It's likely that there will be other features in the development team's pipeline as well, but taking the new features that they have already added along with what they have shared of the future plans and diving into what the affected add-ons that these features intend to replace actually do, it turns out that a few common themes do start to emerge. Starting up with the weak order head-up displays, the majority of these tools rely on tracking the status of our abilities and often trinkets, monitoring cooldowns, charges and procs. Doing this requires access to the character's spellbook and ability information, along with buffs and sometimes debuffs, the latter needed to monitor those procs. At the same time, many of these tools do also perform some very basic calculations, which can be used to highlight abilities at key moments, for example, discouraging the use of cooldowns at a bad time. Moving on to the rotational helpers, and for the most part, these rely on much the same information. Those ability cooldowns and character buffs, but they also need to monitor the number and status of enemies, tracking the buffs, debuffs, and even what those enemies are doing to us. Which means that they also need access to enemy health, buffs and debuffs, along with access to the in-game combat log. Taking a look at add-ons like DBM and Bigwigs, these are essentially supercharged computational stopwatches. In very simplistic terms, the developers encode a timeline of boss abilities, which allows them to predict when raid and dungeon mechanics are incoming. But this information is something that the game does not make available to those add-ons, and this means that those predictions are subject to a degree of inaccuracy. To address this, these add-ons also have to continually monitor when abilities actually happen in order to resync their timers, and over time the add-ons have also increasingly added alerts for not just key raid-wide mechanics, but also for character-specific mechanics. This means that these particular add-ons also need information on what's going on in the fight, which they obtain from a combination of the combat log and monitoring boss and player health bars and buffs. But at the same time, these add-ons also do use the in-game chat and raid marker systems in order to highlight specific character and even on occasions to assign mechanics to them. To top all of that, these add-ons are also capable of communicating with other players' versions of the add-ons, hence the ability to send things like countdowns and break timers. By now, we can certainly see the pattern that is developing, and Details for the most part does nothing to change that, with a majority of its functions relying on the combat log. Final piece in the puzzle is of course nameplate add-ons. The default nameplates are very limited in their functionality, so much so that the majority of information that tools like Platers need to modify the nameplates don't actually come from the in-game nameplates. Guess what? These add-ons also use all the same sources of data that we've already discussed. However, they do have one additional requirement, which is the ability to modify enemy nameplates. So taking a step back now, and I think we've actually got a surprisingly clear picture of where Blizzard may be planning to drop the restrictions on add-ons. So let's take a look exactly what it would mean for add-ons if access to these particular parts of the game were removed. Well, the list of add-ons that require access to this information actually turned out to be a bit smaller than I was expecting. Taking the top 25 add-ons in CurseForward by popularity, we have this list. Almost, but not quite half of the top 25 add-ons are likely to be affected in some way. Now, in all honesty, when I was doing research for this video, I was surprised that the number of affected add-ons isn't actually higher. I've also been very pleasantly surprised by how few non-combat open world add-ons are actually likely to be impacted at all. If I turn out to be right, there's no doubt that my World of Warcraft user interface is going to change quite a bit. But with the exception of nameplates, much of the core of how I interact with the game would actually remain unscathed. Now, there is one add-on in the list that I think could be a bit of a surprise for a lot of people, and it is one that is quite concerning to me, and that's Rare Scanner. This is most definitely not a combat add-on, and plays no part in raid, PvP or dungeons, but it really does rely on being able to read nameplate information. And this does give rise to a major unanswered question. When these add-on restrictions do come, will they apply everywhere, or might they just be limited to when we're in combat or even just in instances? In all of the World of Warcraft team's public communications about these changes, the developers have been at pains to promise us that the majority of non-combat add-ons, they give examples of things like Auction House and Quest Helpers, would be unaffected. But there are nevertheless quite a few important open world add-ons, including Rare Scanner, Silver Dragon, Spy, Bartender and Elf UI, which will very likely be severely impacted by these restrictions. For those rear tracking add-ons, arguably Blizzard just needs to buff up their in-game rear tracking. They already do include some in-game emotes for some but not all rare spawns, and they could commit to adding it for every rare, along with perhaps an in-game buzzer. But the amount of work that this would take to make something like that customizable enough to be usable by most players does make me think that a more likely outcome would be to add some more dedicated support for rear tracking add-ons to use, for example by allowing Rare Scanner and Silver Dragon to see a list of every unique named NPC in a current zone, for example. But there are other add-ons like LVI and Bartender which would be very severely impaired by these restrictions. But would Blizzard really want to inhibit our ability to customize their action bars or user interface? Only time will tell how or even if Blizzard can resolve challenges like this, and I have a suspicion that action bars and nameplates are going to be the two areas that are going to turn out to be the most difficult for the World of Warcraft team to solve in a way that actually works well for players. Blizzard clearly do not want us being able to color code nameplates based on NPC types, buffs or abilities, but at the same time being able to color codes based on threat and co-tank threat is a critical deal breaker for most tank players, so much so that any experienced tank can tell within 10 to 15 seconds if a new co-tank is or is not using threat-based nameplates. This does mean that Blizzard are going to have to find a way to allow at least some controlled customization of nameplates, or perhaps more likely to at least make tank threat color coding a built-in part of the base user interface. So now that we know roughly what add-ons are going to be affected, the big question is, what does all of this mean for us as players? How much are our user interfaces going to change, and how is it going to affect how we play the game? There is no doubt that for raiding, Mythic Plus and PvP, there are going to be very noticeable changes. If you're someone who relies on an add-on like DBM or GTFO to tell you when to move, or when you have a boss ability on you, or a tank that relies on being told when to taunt, you're going to have a lot of adjustments to make. But at the same time, if you do play with the default setup of DBM or Bigwigs, along with one of the popular pre-canned raid or Dungeon Week order packs, it's very likely that more than 50% of the alerts, noises and bars on your screen actually aren't relevant to what you're doing in the moment. And I would bet money that many of your wipes are due to you, and let's be honest here, it was you missing an alert due to visual or audio overload. Assuming that Blizzard can and do deliver on the major improvements that we've seen recently and how abilities are telegraphed on screen, and the new boss timeline is actually good, admittedly a big if, we may well find that having a simpler and cleaner user interface with less visual and audio noise might actually make the fights a bit easier for us, and maybe, just maybe, also a bit more enjoyable. And outside the big three content, I'm now pretty confident that in reality the impacts are going to be few and far between. Your user interface is still going to change, but probably not as much as you would think. In all honesty, I had been pretty worried about Blizzard's plans, and I went into this video expecting to find a ton of major issues. But the more I have investigated, the less problems I've been finding, at least from the perspective of a more mainstream player who does far too much world content, along with heroic raiding and Mythic Plus up to about plus 10 to 12 levels. Now, I will say that if you're a very high-end top 50 plus cutting edge raider or a 0.1% Mythic Plus pusher, you are going to feel the impacts of these changes a lot more. But for the rest of us, I'm fairly convinced that it's going to be pretty smooth. Perhaps at worst we'll end up with an easier than usual raid tier as the designers adjust to a changing landscape. The one remaining worry I have is if Blizzard end up rushing this process, not giving themselves enough time to sufficiently polish their built-in replacements and adjusting their fight designs. The launch issues with the cooldown manager has severely damaged the player base's trust in this process, even before it got started, but that tool is actually very close to being what it needed to be. And had the team given themselves a bit more time to be able to act upon the feedback from the community, both in terms for the need for customization, but also in what things are being tracked, I do think that the community's attitude to the plans would have been a lot better. Blizzard have hinted in some interviews that the restrictions could end up arriving as soon as the start of midnight, a timing which, if true, I think would be a major mistake. The start of an expansion, while a bit of a reset, is also the time when you have the most new and returning players, and a rushed introduction of add-on restrictions at such a time would, in my opinion, just result in a lot of those players quitting early or being put off by a negative community backlash. In my personal opinion, it would be much better for the team to just focus on getting those user interface replacements in place for the start of the expansion, leaving themselves time to address feedback, iterate and improve mid-expansion, with the restrictions then being brought in as an experiment towards the end of an expansion, where it's a lot easier to fix major issues mid-season, or at worst to use the following expansion as a way to reset and recover from any unintended mishaps. But what about all of you? How do you feel about these add-on changes? Will you miss the affected add-ons, or is there another favourite add-on that you're worried about? Let me know in the comments down below. If you found this update helpful, entertaining and even just plain annoying, then do let me know by hitting that like icon. And if you want to support my channel to grow and help me to make more of these videos along with my other content, then also do hit that subscribe button right now before you forget. And if you don't want to miss out whenever I release a new video, then as well as subscribing, you can follow me on social media for notifications. My links are in the description down below as well. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.